I'm really excited to introduce our next guest on the Live and Learn podcast. We're going up in the world. We've now got a doctor. Our first doctor is joining us, Dr. Hazel Harrison. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
If you could just share with some of the people listening in your background, I know you're a clinically trained psychologist, and just share your expertise, because we're really excited to share your insights today.
Thank you. So yes, I'm a clinical psychologist. That's my background. And what I've been really interested in, I suppose, over the last decade really, is working with organisations around how we use some of the tools from clinical psychology to help enhance our lives really, and help our teams to work well together and help us as individuals too to thrive. So my mission has really been this idea of how we bring psychology out of kind of clinics and into our everyday life, and how we can use the theories, the models, the research from psychology to enhance our work and our lives together. So what I've been focusing on is how we can make those tools evidence-based, but also accessible and creative, and hopefully usable, so that people can take some of the ideas and actually do something with them, take some action from the theory. And that's what I've focused on for the last 10 years.
Brilliant. And do you want to describe and talk us through your company in case anyone's looking for some support or help or training program?
So I set up Think Avalana with that big mission. And really what I try and do is work with companies to devise training programs, to come and consult on their wellbeing strategy, to offer coaching and support for perhaps various initiatives that they might be trying to launch, and offer that, I suppose, psychology lens really, being able to come in and look at their organisation from a slightly different perspective and bring my skills and knowledge into the mix.
And I'm really excited about today's episode, which is all about ways to improve psychological safety. Obviously, we've got some great content on mental health, which you helped us with. I think psychological safety, just to kind of kick us off, it's obviously been around a long time, but there's a lot more kind of spotlight on it. Just for people listening in, maybe you could help just describe what it is and maybe the journey it's also been on in terms of the stigma's lifted a little bit and there's a lot more conscious thought on improving it.
So psychological safety really is this idea that people feel safe in their teams, safe to take risks, safe to share ideas, safe to seek feedback. So psychological safety is really that element of feeling that you are within a team that's got your back and that you're going to be supported in that. And that you can share perhaps a different point of view. You know, it's okay to perhaps feel differently to the other people in the team. And that's what creates this sense of psychological safety. And Amy Edmondson coined this phrase and has done a lot of research in this area. And then Google started looking at, okay, how do teams function well together? What are the elements that go into making a team work really well together? And that's when they really kind of launched, I suppose, or rocketed Amy's research so that we all now know a lot more about it, which is psychological safety scored incredibly high in understanding which of the teams that were working really well together. And it was these teams that demonstrated these elements of trust, of feeling that you can seek feedback, of feeling that you can have an alternative perspective. And that's how we understand psychological safety. I think it sometimes gets misunderstood. And sometimes people think it's about having a place where everyone feels like all warm and fluffy and lovely all the time, and like it's working somewhere where you just feel amazing and happy. And of course, there are connections with psychological safety and well-being, but it isn't necessarily always about feeling great. Actually, psychological safety can sometimes mean we have to have quite uncomfortable conversations.
Challenge each other as well.
We've got to actually talk about some difficult stuff in order to keep learning together. Psychological safety sometimes gets confused as job security.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that either. So I think it's a word that we probably really need to understand in its, in its purest form, so that we can know how we can take that knowledge. And as you know, I want to think, how do we apply it? How do businesses make sense of psychological safety so that they can get their teams working really well together?
How do you, when you work with businesses, start approaching how to improve psychological safety? So I think one of the things we were prepping was it's got to come or start from, or some of it from leaders and from above. How important is their role in terms of ensuring their teams are psychologically safe and practicing what they preach probably as well?
Yes. So I think leaders have a really important role to play in psychological safety, because a lot of what they're doing is obviously modelling the culture of the organisation too. So the way that they approach some of these challenges will define how perhaps those who are newer to a team or still understanding the values of the organisation, you know, they're going to take all of that sort of on through how the leader lives their role and the things that they do. So that might sound like there's a lot of pressure on the leaders, but actually I think there's some really simple things that leaders can do that can help to build psychological safety. First of all, there's a real element of trust in there that needs to be built. Leaders might be tempted to just say to their teams, like, trust me, you know.
Without backing it up. Yeah. See, I think we've all probably seen that. Yeah,
exactly. So we know that from, you know, the research into trust, that trust builds in micro moments throughout the day, throughout our interactions with our leaders. And so it's not something that we can necessarily force people to do, but instead it happens through us being consistent in our behaviours, reliable, doing the things we say we're going to do. So that helps us to build trust. But also, I think we can build trust through moments of vulnerability too.
Yep.
And sometimes it's important that leaders model that aspect of getting things wrong and recognising that there's perhaps something to learn in that moment where things might have not gone the way that they had hoped, and being open about those things so that we are modelling actually just being human, as opposed to, and that's okay. And that's what innovative teams that are, you know, being collaborative and trying new things, they will be getting things wrong. So sometimes I think it's important that the leader models that aspect too, you know, and is able to share stuff that went wrong. And I think vulnerability is a tricky one. I think sometimes there's a sense that, you know, we might take the pendulum too far towards vulnerability.
I was just going to ask about that. Yeah, you can tell.
Yeah. And that sense of like, oh, maybe being vulnerable means I need to share everything about my life in order for my team to be psychologically safe. I don't think that's true either. I think it's really important that leaders have some clear boundaries as to what they feel comfortable and not comfortable sharing. I don't think it means about being vulnerable all the time. Yeah. But I do think there's an element of being human that's very helpful in building that sense of trust within the team, and accompanying that, perhaps that sense of not blaming people in the team, taking ownership over things that are happening together, thinking about what can we learn from this together. And all of that just helps to build that sense that the team are working collaboratively towards something. So those are a couple of things, I think, those moments of vulnerability and building trust, but also in how we approach mistakes and the blaming.
And I think it's probably quite hard, I guess, in a business context, if a mistake might cost, you know, the company money, or people have this self-preservation sometimes. You often hear lots of stuff about politics in the workplace and so on. How do you find getting that balance between people worried about, you know, at work there's more, you know, consequences if you do something wrong potentially? Yes. Yeah. How do you overcome that and this performance on one side versus having that psychologically safe environment for your team? How do you kind of find that marriage? Sometimes can be difficult to navigate and get both sides, I guess.
Yes, and I think what you're describing, obviously, is that element of, yes, sometimes mistakes are costly, but if we don't learn as a team how to approach those in a way that means that we won't repeat those mistakes, then we'll continue to make costly mistakes. So the solution to that is having a team that's willing to be open-minded to learning. And the solution to that is not having a team that blames each other so that no one takes responsibility for the learning. So if as a team we take responsibility for something that has gone wrong with a recognition that we don't want to repeat this again, then I think that enables that sort of strong sense of psychological safety, but also hopefully less damage to the company longer term too. And of course, that's what Amy found in her research when she was looking in psychological safety within hospital settings. She was finding that the teams with more psychological safety were the ones reporting more mistakes. So on the surface of it, you could say, okay, so teams with more psychological safety make more mistakes. But when she dug a little deeper, what she actually found was the teams that have this higher sense of safety within them feel more able to report the things that are going wrong. and the other teams were hiding the mistakes. And if we start hiding our mistakes, there's no possible way we can learn anything good from them, right?
It's not a good thing, no.
So I think there is that aspect of being willing to keep learning, to being open-minded to that, which whilst in the short term, yes, there may be some harm to the company when mistakes are made, in the longer term, hopefully not repeated.
And I guess where does kind of feedback come into this as well? So I think when we were doing our preparation, which we don't just throw this stuff together.
What? Of course we do.
I guess chatting about 360 feedback can help this in some ways, in terms of it isn't just a manager or leader kind of preaching to their teams or their colleagues. How would you say some people maybe don't always feel comfortable with that as well? They're not used to 360 feedback or reverse mentoring or whatever you want to call it, lots of other ways around it. You got any top tips to share on how to maybe people feel more comfortable with this?
Yes. So I think with feedback, it is a really tricky one, because if you've not worked somewhere before, or you've not been in an environment where you're used to getting feedback, then it can feel really uncomfortable and can feel slanted towards only getting feedback for the stuff that's gone wrong, and therefore perhaps particularly just disheartening, and you might just want to close your mind off to that and feel like, I don't really want to know.
Feel attacked.
Or feel attacked.
Feel like that, yeah.
So there's a really helpful, I suppose, culture of feedback that we want to build within organisations, which means that it's balanced. We're not just going to necessarily hear about all the things that we're doing wrong, but that we're actually inviting feedback that enables a sense of appreciation and gratitude for the things that are working well too. And this isn't that kind of, are we swearing on this podcast or not? Some people call it like a shit sandwich, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
I wasn't sure what the terminology was.
Absolutely. We all know what that means, I think. Everyone's come across that, and everyone's probably...
It's the bleep sandwich.
And everyone's probably had one as well. That's the problem.
Yes.
We've received one in their career.
I don't think we're necessarily talking about that in that sort of way where we have to think of something good to say to this person before we tell them the thing.
That's the classic mistake, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
It's like we want to be authentic in our feedback. And as a leader, we want to get good at spotting what the team is doing well and making sure that we find ways to appreciate what the team is doing well and to call that out individually. But also we do want to have a place where we're sharing helpful feedback to enable people to improve their skills and abilities. And I think part of that actually comes from a place of feeling that someone cares about you.
Yeah.
And, and also how we ask for feedback. So I will often ask, after I've done a keynote or a training session with a team, I will say, it's really important to me that I keep learning and improving. So I would love you to tell me 1 or 2 things that you think I could do better if we did this again. Now that's very different feedback seeking than the question, how did I do?
Yeah, it's very open-ended.
Because if you ask someone how they did, generally we maybe want to say like, you did great.
The first thing, instinct, absolutely.
So I think one of the things about building a culture of feedback is learning how to be specific in asking for the feedback that you want, whether that be asking your manager or whether the manager is asking their team, actually just getting better at seeking the sort of feedback that we need and recognising that we need it from a variety of places, and everyone has a unique perspective to bring. And to see feedback as a gift. And I think that's the mindset shift that can happen sometimes when you feel psychologically safe in your team. You feel like these people really care about me. They want me to do well. Then instead of seeing this as a criticism, we start to see things that we can do to improve as being something helpful.
Yes. And I think with feedback is viewing it as people are thinking these things anyway. It's better to hear it and improve.
Yes.
Regardless. Yeah. Than just kind of putting your head in the sand, I guess.
And I think it's important to think, when is the right time for feedback too? There's a timing element in that. Sometimes it's just, that someone's not quite in the right place. Perhaps something big has happened at work and they're still trying to process that. It's probably not the time to say, let me tell you 5 things you could do to improve.
I was about to say, I think what I find fascinating is when I've listened to lots of podcasts or read blogs on feedback, and obviously timing is really important. But I think I was quite interested in the angle of it's also got to be right for the manager or leader as well. They've got to be in the right place to do it.
Yes.
And obviously best practice is to give the feedback as soon as possible. But I guess to be psychologically safe, you need to make sure it's going to be constructive and in the right tone as well. And timing, maybe it's waiting a little bit sometimes and not always diving in. Like you said, there's been a big mistake. Maybe they've got some challenges at home or whatever. Was that something you'd back up as well? It's got to be not always instant. It's got,
Yes.
there's a timing element as well.
I would say capture the feedback.
Yeah.
If you're someone who's wanting to give feedback to someone else in your team, capture it somewhere, store it so that you don't forget what it is that might be useful. But then sometimes you can have that conversation. I've got some ideas I'd love to share about what happened in that meeting. When would be a good time for us to sit down and talk that through? Is it a good time now to hear that feedback? Are you in the right place to hear that feedback? So all of this then comes back to that sense of feeling that we can be open with each other and saying, do you know what, actually, I've had a heck of a day today. I don't think I am in the right place to learn from your feedback today. Can we come back to it tomorrow?
And that's fine.
And that's okay. And we have to recognise that. So that it can be helpful. And if we're always coming from that place of I'm wanting to share this to be helpful to this person, then we're holding in mind that bigger picture of when is the right time for them to take this on and learn something from it.
And what would your advice be? I mean, we've got a video on it on embracing your introverts and extroverts. How would you feel? I think it's easier. I mean, from my experience, you've got people that you've worked with many years together. You probably built up that psychological safety. Maybe you worked together 5 days in the office before the pandemic. You've got someone who's new to business or is fully remote, say, or they're just quite introverted and don't feel comfortable maybe voicing their opinion. What would your advice be on getting everyone involved in this psychological safety? Some people may be easier than others to get on board with it and get that process.
Yes. I think technology can be really helpful for us in some of this. Obviously, for some companies, there are still many days when people are working remotely. And I think we're still learning from the research and innovation what works best for that and how we can create meetings that enable everyone to feel heard, whether they're in person or remote or a combination of the two. And that, I think, is a real challenge still. But I know that there are companies like Microsoft Teams, for example, that has built in an app now where you can get a sense of who's speaking most in meetings by it analysing the data of who's talking when.
Yeah, that'd be quite interesting, actually.
And so even just doing simple measures like that might help you to see that there are some voices that aren't being heard.
Yeah.
And even if you don't do that all the time, just having a moment to really look at who's owning some of this airtime and who isn't getting any can be a helpful statistic to then take and use to have a conversation with perhaps people who feel less able to get that airtime, or it may be that there's other people in the meeting that need to be shushed a little so that there is some space for speaking, and we won't necessarily know that without the data. So sometimes the data can be helpful in supporting that. And then I think there is that aspect of individual difference and recognising that there may be other ways that people want to share their opinions, making sure that we have different routes to feeding back so that it's not just, does anyone have anything they want to say about that in a meeting full of hundreds of people?
Right at the end when everyone's tired and hungry,
and we
or
all
whatever.
want to go home and whatever, do something else with our day. So I think, it's important for leaders to think about what are the different mechanisms for feedback, how do we elicit and make sure that other voices are being heard. But also I think it can be quite empowering to have a conversation with someone in your team to say, I've noticed that your voice isn't being heard and we'd love to hear from it. You matter to us. We want you in this team and we want to know what you think. Because perhaps there's a conversation there that might mean that they can learn what it is that individual needs in order to be able to share their opinions too, regardless of whether you use introverted or extroverted language. At the end of the day, there will be different ways that people want to share their ideas, and we have to learn what those are.
And I guess I'm fascinated already. You shared some almost language or sentences that leaders can use to encourage psychological safety. Is any others you could kind of share? Maybe that replace classic mistakes people make. They shouldn't say things like "you did this" or "it went wrong because of this" or whatever. Is there ways or some key phrases you've seen in your experience or career that can really put that meeting on the right path?
I think definitely using the word "we" is a really strong way to bring us together and particularly perhaps to recognise that when we use the word we're describing more than just one person. We're describing
calling them out, or
potentially a team. So recognising that we are as a team is really helpful. I think that the language around mistakes, we've talked about this a little bit already. You know, what can we learn? How do we shift our lens from the blaming to the learning? And generally asking the team these questions as well, and trying to perhaps realign how we're looking at a particular issue or problem through that lens of what can we learn. And I think Amy Edmondson's work has a really lovely crossover with Carol Dweck's work around growth mindset, and this idea that we want to be open to the possibility that we can improve our skills and abilities through the things we've already talked about, you know, seeking feedback and trying new things and making mistakes, and not deliberately making mistakes, but we will inevitably make some mistakes because we're humans, and that just happens sometimes. So I think it's also that non-judgmental and perhaps slightly more compassionate language that we can start to use around how we are with each other. We can be quite hard on ourselves in our own heads.
Yeah.
And from a clinical psychology perspective, I've been very interested in these ideas around compassion and self-compassion, and trying to, particularly when we're facing adversity or some sort of challenge, actually how we dial up that voice inside our head that recognises that we're doing our best, and actually not beating ourselves up. Because generally when we beat ourselves up, we have worse outcomes than if we just accept where we are and we think about how we want to move forward. And I think the same is true for building a kind of compassionate mindset within a team too. You know, it's like, don't beat the team up for stuff that isn't working and the adversity that you might be going through, because ultimately it will probably lead to a worse outcome than finding that compassion to go, okay, we're here, we're in a moment of struggle like many other people will have been in many other organisations, and what do we do now?
Maybe we just touch on why it matters and why people and businesses are finally waking up to this idea and realising the difference it can make.
So I think we're still learning from the research about the big differences it can make. Some of the things that we're discovering is it makes teams more innovative because they are more collaborative, working better together, feeling perhaps safer in taking risks and trying something perhaps a little bit different, and therefore feeling okay about being brave and curious and expanding out into new areas that they want to explore. Also, we know that levels of psychological safety seem to link to well-being. So those who have higher psychological safety also tend to experience high levels of well-being, and by that I mean our ability to feel good and to function effectively. So there's definitely some crossover there. I think we also know is that teams are more engaged in the work that they're doing when they have higher levels of psychological safety, probably because you're not spending half your time like looking over your back to see, you know, if anyone's sort of, I don't know, got it in for you, or is stealing your ideas, or you're in this together, and so you feel more engaged in the work that you're doing. I think those in itself, we're probably going to learn a lot more aspects of what psychological safety does and why it might be helpful for teams, but just to know that it enhances well-being, that it makes teams more productive, more collaborative, more innovative. I think those things in and of itself are just such great reasons to invest in this. And that's, for me, the evidence base and how that comes to life. It's like, okay, if we learnt that this is good for teams and it does these things that we think it might do to increase particular areas that businesses may want to focus on, then how do we bring it to life? What do we actually do to enable leaders to create teams that are psychologically safe?
You shared some really handy, tips for key phrases and language that leaders and managers can use to help their teams feel psychologically safe. I forget the exact stat, you'll probably correct me, in terms of non-verbal communication. I think 80 or 90% of how you act is actually interpreted by your body language or not actually what you say. Is there any things in terms of body language you would say that can help psychological safety in meetings or any context that leaders have with their teams?
Yes. If we're saying that part of psychological safety is creating this sense of trust within a team where people feel able to share their ideas without fear that there's some sort of interpersonal risk in there, what we're really talking about is people feeling able to express their opinions without feeling that someone else is going to kind of, say some snide comment or make them feel silly or stupid or worse, and some aspect of humiliation. When we have low psychological safety, those are all the things that people are worried about. I don't want to be too vulnerable because it doesn't feel safe, and I'll feel humiliated if I share an idea, or I'll be shot down for it. So if we're talking about those high levels of psychological safety and how we create those, what we need from the rest of the team is to show that they're engaged and interested and want to hear these ideas, and particularly we need the leader to demonstrate those behaviours. So non-verbally, we need to be communicating that we're listening. There is nothing, I think, more, I don't know, it may be insulting or demotivating than sharing an idea, or someone is looking at their phone
on their laptop
or on their
laptop.
Basically you're saying this piece of kit that's in front of me is more important than the person that's in front of me sharing an idea, and that can be, I think, disheartening and can shut people down from wanting to do that. So there are all of those things that I'm sure Video Arts has got tons of this in their catalogue of actually how to actively listen without actually necessarily saying much, through your body language, through your nodding, through making eye contact, through not looking at your tech, that enables someone to feel like not only am I sharing my ideas, but they're really being listened to.
And we always end our podcast with Live and Learn. Obviously, that's the title of the show. Have you got one top tip for psychological safety? It could be an anecdote or something you've experienced in your career that you wish you knew 5-10 years ago on this subject, that something we can leave our listeners with.
Definitely. I think one thing for building psychological safety is this element that we've talked a little bit about today already, which is about being human. Coming to work, being a human. The pressure, particularly that leaders put on themselves to be superhuman, I think sometimes can backfire. If you are someone that seems like you're a superhero and you know how to do everything and it's all looking really easy, but actually behind the scenes it's really hard and really challenging, I think what you're not really doing is helping your team to recognise the hard work and the effort that's going into the role that you're doing. And I think it's probably much more healthy to find ways to be human. And we talked about this at the start, to be vulnerable, to share perhaps some of the things that you're learning along the way too, so that other people can recognise that they're still learning, you're still learning, you're in a culture of people that are learning. And that in itself, I think, is a great way to keep building trust.
Brilliant. I think that's a perfect way to probably end this episode. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot myself personally. And thank you for coming on to the show, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.